So now that we're getting this query parameter information here, we of course also have to use it not just to update this button text and behavior here, or this link text and behavior, but instead to update the tasks that are displayed on the screen. Now here I'm using signals for computing my tasks. Therefore, to keep things simple here, I'll actually change this order property from a regular property to a property that holds a signal value by executing that signal function that's provided by Angular. And it should be a signal that manages a string that's either ASC or DESC, and I'll start with DESC as a default, let's say, to be in line with the defaults I'm managing here on that link. Now, order is a signal, so down here, when I set it, we should set it by calling the set method on that signal, like this. Or, of course, we could rely on this input binding to keep things even simpler. But here, for demo purposes, I'll use this approach. And then in the tasks component HTML file, we of course want to read order again, since it is now a signal again. But in the TypeScript file, we now need to edit this computed signal function here. Because now it's no longer enough to just filter our signals and get a filtered array. Instead, that filtered array now also must be sorted with the sort method. And this sort method is of course a default method offered by JavaScript in the browser. It takes a function as an argument, a function which will itself receive two parameters, since it will always compare two items from that array at the same time. And in this function here, I then want to take a look at my order and check if it's DESC for descending. And in that case, I'll return the result of comparing A's ID to B's ID. And if it's greater, I want to return -1, otherwise +1. Else, if order is ascending or not set, I'll return the opposite. And that should give me the sorting behavior I want. And if you do that all, and you go back, you should see tasks in this order. So here the task with the title of Prepare Issue Template comes first. And that makes sense because it has an ID that's bigger than the ID of this Build First Prototype task. And since the default is to sort in descending order, the bigger ID should come first, and that's exactly what's happening here. But as I then click Sort Ascending, the order changes and the item with the smaller ID comes first. And now we can toggle between these modes with help of query parameters and, in this case, signals. And that's of course just one way of implementing this. Not necessarily the shortest and most concise way, but hopefully a way where it's clear what's going on here. So now at this point, you did learn a lot about routing in Angular apps. But there's even more the Angular router offers to us. For example, you can also leverage the Angular router to fetch and prepare data for your routes, so for your components. For example, here for this route, this user's user ID route that loads the user tasks component. This component uses some data or needs to fetch some data internally. It needs to, in the end, fetch the username of the user for whom the tasks should be displayed, and that username depends on the route parameters because it, in the end, depends on that user ID that's part of the path. Now, currently, I'm fetching that username here in ng-on-init by subscribing to changes to my route parameters and by then getting the username from the user's service. Alternatively, as you saw before, we could have worked with signals and, for example, use a computed signal. But there's yet another option you could use to fetch data for a component. An option that would allow you to keep your component class leaner, which is something you might want to do. So an option that in the end allows you to get this data fetching code here out of this component, which you don't have to do, but which you might want to do, because there definitely also is some merit to having lean, clean components. Because Angular's router actually allows you to define a data property on your routes, so in your route configuration. There are indeed many properties you can add, and we'll explore other important ones like can match later, but there, for example, also is this data property I just mentioned. And this data property in the end allows you to define some data object, and that data object can hold any key value pairs of your choice. Like, for example, message hello, which is not too meaningful here for this application, but which allows me to introduce you to this data object and how it works. So you can set any arbitrary static data of your choice for a route and the routed component with help of that data property on the route configuration. And if you do so, you can go to the component that is loaded by this route. So in this case, the user tasks component. And in there, you can get hold of that data in two main ways. If you enabled this component input binding here in the route configuration, any data key that is set up here, like message in my case, will be provided as an input to the component that's loaded for the route. So in my case here, this user tasks component will receive a message property, a message input, because I added this data here and because I have with component input binding enabled. Therefore, in this component, we could accept that input. We would get our message here as an input, for example, with that input function. And I know that I'll get a string here in the end. And I can even make this required here, since I know that this will be set, because I'm setting that message data here. Well, and then we could use that. For example, here, to keep things simple, I can console log input data, and then simply output this message and read that input here in ng-on init. With that, in this application, if I select a user, I see that input data being logged here, and that's my message. So that's how you could pass some static data, like this static string, to a route. But that's not ultimately what I want to do here, because here I mentioned that I want to outsource this data fetching. And that's of course not static data, but dynamic data, because it depends on the user ID route parameter. So that's therefore what we'll do next, but it's also worth knowing that if you had some static data, you could provide it with that data property. But now we're going to take that data fetching to the next level.